Welcome, everybody. So this is a flipped lecture for Chapter 2, Transplantations in Borderlands. If you would prefer to read the chapter on your own, you are more than welcome to take that approach. This is for people who sort of has suggested to us in the past that approaching all of these chapters by themselves without any sort of help was just a bit onerous and just a bit hard. So for those sort of oral learners, people better at listening, this is for you. You also have a guided notes sheet that is available in Schoology that you can use if you'd like. You don't have to. So this is hopefully going to be helpful to you. So firstly, let me strongly recommend that you actually start by reading the intro and the conclusion to the Brinkley chapter before we begin. I'm not going to bore you by reading them to you. You can certainly do it on your own, but one thing I would strongly recommend before you ever dive into this book is to read the intro and the conclusion, as well as scan through the pictures so you have some visuals, read the captions so you can see the major themes and most important ideas. This is where Brinkley's the strongest. This is where I think people do their best learning, and it's also ironically the part that most people skip to get to what they think is important, which is all this kind of dense text. So I would strongly recommend intro, conclusion, do that. Pause the video, go ahead, read that at your leisure. Now that you are back, I assume, one you'll find is the major story in this chapter is how private groups of Englishmen tried to transport English society to a new world, but how that wasn't inevitably a failure. They were changed by their environment, by Native Americans, by other conflict with other European groups or even other European immigrants. And so that's sort of the narrative we're going to be looking for, how they tried to transplant English society, but how they quickly had to sort of change goal and change course and what some of that change looked like. So for each sort of colonial group, and we're not going to run through all 13 colonies, we're sort of going to lump them into 4 different regions. But for each group, we're going to be talking about the founder effect and then some what we might consider to be representative stories. So what we mean by the founder effect is that when a group establishes themselves in an area, other people, whether they're from other cultures or the same culture, will tend to adopt the habits and customs and government of their new culture. So, for example, for something like Pennsylvania, which is established by Quakers, Quakers are never a majority of Pennsylvania, but we can call Pennsylvania a Quaker colony because the Germans and the Dutch and the Native Americans and other groups will sort of have to adapt to this Quaker culture that's established in the government and in this society that's broader. So that's not to say that diverse populations don't have an impact on the people that they sort of enter into. It'd be ridiculous to say that immigrants did not have an impact into society, but that impact, it's probably safer to say that immigrants themselves are even more impacted, and it's important to say who founded the colony. Even though we're not still Puritans, you can still see lingering influence of Puritan culture on Massachusetts today, although that's waning. So we're going to start with the Chesapeake colonies. In 1607, you have the founding of Jamestown, and so we have the founding of the Chesapeake. And as you can see from that purple arrow, that's pointing at the Chesapeake Bay. So when we say the Chesapeake colonies, we really mean Maryland and Virginia, though Delaware probably also fits because you can grow tobacco there. And North Carolina also kind of fits because you can grow tobacco there, even though it's not part of the Chesapeake, though North Carolina's got its own thing going on. And as I've said, tobacco is sort of the key idea. And so when you look at the initial founding of Jamestown, it was a disaster. In 1607, the Virginia Company, a private joint stock company, founded Jamestown in order to turn a profit. A joint stock company is something where, in order to reduce the enormous financial risk of doing something, you buy stock like you would at any sort of major corporation today, and then you can share in the profits. But because this was a profit-driven motive, this was not families looking to establish permanent settlements. This was men, oftentimes adventurers, merchants, people like that, coming to sort of make a quick buck and leave. And sort of one of the famous stories is the men frantically digging for gold, which does not exist in Virginia, rather than planting crops that they will need to sustain themselves in the winter. They also found Jamestown in the middle of a very swampy area. And this swampy area looked great in the spring when they arrived. There was giant oysters and strawberries and fish, and they thought they'd live like kings and would not even have to farm. But that water very quickly became brackish, undrinkable, and the air became filled with mosquitoes. And so all these things, from poor organization, from the lacking of planting crops, the swampy air, resulted in a 50 to 75% death rate every single year. So 1607, they bring a bunch of people, 75% of them die. 1608, a few more boats arrive, 75% of them die. And this continues for a few years, including the starving time of 1609, in which they turn to cannibalism because life has gotten so hard for them. And they really rely on the Native Americans for their food supply. And so but they do eventually figure it out. And we take a look at 1619 as being one of those key years in all of American history, because it is the moment when Jamestown becomes sustainable. First and foremost, tobacco becomes a profitable crop. And while this was probably first established in 1616, we just sort of pin it with 1619 because that's convenient. But John Rolfe, the guy who marries Pocahontas, he sort of figures out that there is a strain of tobacco that can grow well in the Chesapeake region. And tobacco is an addictive drug. It becomes fashionable in England to use this addictive drug. And so now you finally have a money-making opportunity. Also, they get themselves better organized. Not perfect, but better. They establish the House of Burgesses, which is the first representative legislature. That's a year before the Mayflower Compact. Virginia can lay claim to the first democracy. Granted, it's just landowners, but it's a start. And 1619 is also when we see the introduction of African slavery, which will have a profound impact in the decades going forward, and obviously a profound impact on American history. But, however, even with that introduction of African slavery, slaves are not the predominant labor source for at least the first 50 years of Jamestown. So they're there, all right, but we'll figure out what happens and how they become the predominant labor force. So now that we've established a colony that works, that makes money, that has some sort of organization, we need to bring people in. Remember, this is a business, and you aren't going to turn a profit unless you have a lot of people growing tobacco. So what the Virginia Company and what the House of Burgesses establishes is something called the headright system. This is sort of almost like an early version of what we'll see as the Homestead Act during the Civil War, which is a way of getting people to settle on farms. And so you promise them at the rock bottom price of 50 cents an acre, which was comically cheap for the era. You can have up to 100 acres of your own land. What an amazing promise! All right, this is, remember, England. There's no available land in England. All right, that's all been used up for millennia. All right, and we have now just the promise of your own farm. So this is attractive enough, and there are people who pay for their own voyage, pay over. That's expensive. All right, you have to have a little bit of money. But that's not going to get enough people to sort of fill up the Tidewater area of Virginia. So instead, they turn to indentured servants. You need a lot of labor. Tobacco, it's important to know this, is an incredibly labor-intensive crop. Also, it is an incredibly environmentally intensive crop. Right? When you plant tobacco, it's going to use up the nutrients in the soil in a matter of a few years. So you're going to need to keep expanding your tobacco plantation. Right, in order to keep growing tobacco, you need more and more and more land to let the other land lie fallow and rest. And so one way you can do this is if you are a landowner and you've sort of used up all the nutrients in your soil, then you can hire a couple indentured servants. You pay their passage, they have to work for you for 7 to 10 years, which takes care of your labor problems, and then when they're out, they can get their own piece of land. Right? So it's sort of a way of getting humans across. And we can see from the image that we're not going to be attracting necessarily the best people. Right? We're not attracting people who are successful in England. If you're successful in England, you stay in England. If you're unsuccessful, say you're a prisoner, you're a Cornishman who's in an English prison, then you're going to be a little more attracted to this idea of, hey, we'll let you out of prison if you get the heck out of here and go to Virginia. And so this is going to be very, very risky. I can't imagine making this choice to leave everything I've known, go on a boat across the ocean, 7 to 10 years of basically slave labor, all for the promise of a farm down the line. So think about what type of person would take that. But we sort of are now going to have a steady stream of people entering Virginia. And this is important to know, Virginia will be the most populous colony and state in early America for quite a while. Virginia has the most people. And so this is going to be successful in sort of attracting those people. But one thing we have that's going on, and I'm sorry about my image, it keeps expanding up there, that says a law in Maryland concerning religion. You wouldn't know it from that image, but it says that. So Maryland is going to try something very similar. All right, so you have a Catholic guy named Lord Baltimore is going to want to establish another colony, but somewhere for the Catholics to go. So basically, we're going to go plant tobacco, we're going to have indentured servants, we're going to follow that same pattern, but maybe you're not Anglican, maybe you're Catholic, this will be your little slice of heaven. But what happens is the Catholics quickly become outnumbered. It doesn't attract quite enough Catholics. So what they do is they look around them, they say, uh-oh, we're now in the minority, and we haven't been very nice for the few years we were in the majority, so maybe we could suggest a law of religious toleration, or what they call an act concerning religion. This is toleration, saying we both have the right to practice Christianity in our own way. So it's really one of the founding moments of religious freedom. We'll see a few other founding moments of religious freedom. Certainly Rhode Island likes to lay claim to that by founding, with Roger Williams' founding. Pennsylvania likes to lay claim to that with the Quakers. There are many places that sort of claim to be religiously tolerant, religious freedom's birthplace in America. But I think Maryland has a pretty good claim to it. But let's get back to Virginia, because something's going to go horribly awry. We are now in generation 2.0, or maybe even generation 3.0. And we now have everyone's favorite name for any rebellion ever, and it's Bacon's Rebellion. So what happens? What's going to take place is you have that guy, Nathaniel Bacon. Right? You can take a quick look at him, and he's pretty haughty, right? He's got nice clothes on. He was the cousin of the governor of Virginia, so he's politically well connected. He arrives in Virginia. He's given an estate way out west in what's called the Piedmont region, sort of the land that's left. There's the Tidewater region, which is near the coast, good for growing tobacco. There's the Piedmont, which is much more hilly and less good for growing tobacco. It's also right at the edge of Native American settlements. So by 1676, because of this environmental pressure of tobacco and the need to keep expanding one's own land holdings to keep being profitable, we have a problem. We are now out of land. Right? And as they've been expanding west, they've been getting in fights with Native Americans. And in order to sort of settle those fights and prevent those fights, the governor essentially says, all right, we are going to stop expanding west. Well, imagine you were one of those people who got on a boat. You worked 7 to 10 years in slave labor conditions. You get out of your indentured servitude, and the governor says, oh, sorry, we don't want to make those Native Americans angry, so you don't actually get the land that was promised to you. He would obviously be enraged. And this rage goes in two directions. The rage goes towards the government and what seems to be a bunch of politically well-connected insiders, of which Nathaniel Bacon should be one of them, but he's going to take a different tack. And the rage is going to go towards the Native Americans as well. Sort of these two groups of people that seem to be sort of pinning them in and denying them this thing that they feel entitled to. And so Nathaniel Bacon, weirdly enough, will become the leader of this people who feel unentitled. He will feel the government's making the wrong direction, and so he sort of becomes the aristocratic peasant rebellion leader. And so it doesn't work. There's some really awesome stories in Bacon's Rebellion where they take Jamestown, they burn it to the ground, they capture the wives of the House of Burgesses members, they put them on ramparts and use them as human shields. I mean, there's some great stories. There's also some terrible stories of wiping out Indian villages because they felt like it. All right, that's less important to us. The main thing we need to know about Bacon's Rebellion is that it becomes obvious that indentured servitude is a bad idea, right? Bringing in these people, promising them land that you don't have, ain't gonna work any longer. And so this becomes the long-term result of Bacon's Rebellion. This is what you need to know about Bacon's Rebellion. You should know everything about Bacon's Rebellion, but this is what you gotta know. All right, so this is, you can see here, Bacon's Rebellion was 1676. We see a sharp decrease. It actually begins a little bit earlier, but a sharp decrease in servants, indentured servants. And you see a sharp increase in slaves. All right, if you don't, the problem with indentured servants is they can run away, and it's hard to catch them because they can blend into the rest of the English population. Their terms of service are limited, and they end up starting rebellions. So you can, get rid of most of that by bringing in enslaved Africans. Remember, enslaved Africans had been coming in as early as 1619, but you can see the numbers start to sharply increase after Bacon's Rebellion and the vast majority of laborers becoming African slaves. And this is when you start to get the slave laws saying that a slave who has a child, that person is permanently a slave forever. Sort of the racial codification of slavery takes place in this era. And weirdly enough, racism will also grow in this era. We tend to think that racism must have come before slavery, but actually the opposite is true. Slavery happens, and then you have to justify your inhuman treatment of another person, so you turn to racial theory as a way of doing it. These people are not equal to me. These people are savages, and so therefore they must be enslaved. So you start to see also the growth of racist ideology in this era as well, and this growth will just continue continue all the way through the Civil War and beyond. So we're going to leave Virginia. Virginia is now sort of becoming it's still dependent on tobacco, and it's becoming increasingly dependent on African slave labor. And they still remain the most populous colony. So let's go to the second most populous area, and that is New England. So in New England, we're talking about Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and obviously, these are 4 different states. Maine will remain part of Massachusetts until 1820. Vermont is kind of its own weird thing that we'll deal with later. But sort of these are offshoots of the same cultural group, the Puritans. And I have a picture from a movie in the 1950s on Puritans, and I like this image. Their clothing is wrong, but besides that, like, the church is right. It is austere, it is bare, people are gripped by the words of the preacher. He is seeming to be threatening them, and that is sort of a pretty accurate way of thinking about the Puritans. So before we go any further, we really need to unpack who these Puritans were. They are probably, in my opinion, the most foreign group of Americans for you guys. All right, if you're thinking, what are the Puritans like? What do they think? How do they act? They are very, very different than us today. Fundamentally different. So first, let's unpack what we mean by a Puritan. There's the Pilgrims. That's who we think of when we think of Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower. And then there's the Puritans. So the Pilgrims were separatists. They said the Church of England is so thoroughly corrupt that we need to separate. We need to get away from that corrupt institution if we're going to find God. And they're the ones who come to Plymouth in 1620. They're the ones that you learned about if you went to Plymouth Plantation in 5th grade. They're the ones who, only 37 of them were on the Mayflower, but they will sort of establish a successful colony in Plymouth, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The Puritans, of which they're very similar to the Pilgrims, culturally so, but the Puritans have a little more faith in the Anglican Church. And the Puritans sort of view themselves as having a more important role in the broader world. And so therefore they're more historically significant. They found Mass Bay Company in 1630 and found the Mass Bay Colony beyond that. And they really believed that they could reform the Church of England. Not through sort of, working their way up through the Church of England's hierarchy, but instead by providing a model for all other Christians to follow, what John Winthrop will call a city on a hill, and still has sort of profound, I'm blanking on the word, so I'm just going to move forward. Sort of idea still in Boston history. But it's also, you see a much larger number of people are Puritans than are Pilgrims. They call themselves the Great Migration, and it's not that great. 20,000 people come over the course of 20 years, but it's sort of a much more significant number of people. And eventually, these 2 colonies, the Plymouth Colony and the Mass Bay Colony, will be combined to form Massachusetts, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So we still need to unpack who these Puritans are and what they believe. So first of all, Their churches are congregational, meaning that if you are a church member, then you get a say in that church. Now, it is enormously difficult to become a member of that church. To become a member of church, you have to prove that God has already picked you for heaven. I don't even know how you do that. All right, but there is sort of the roots of democracy built within this, right? If you are a member of the church, you vote. So this is a theocratic society. It's like a weird theocracy democracy blend, and they really truly believe this is not just something they told themselves. They truly believe this, and it caused them a great amount of stress and worry and arguing and dissenting. But they believed they had a covenant with God in the same way that the old Israelites had a covenant with God. They believed that God was sort of giving them this opportunity to live in his way. This would be a society based on the rules of the Bible. And that their job was to work together in this very austere and joyless community in order to sort of make God's plan here on earth. And if they did it, he would bless their community. If they failed in any way, shape, or form, then God would smite and punish them. That's stressful. And these are also Calvinists who believe that God has already predestined them for heaven or hell. And they're deeply fearful of God's wrath. So their entire life is trying to honor this God who they believe has already picked them for heaven. Holy moly. And these guys are stressed out. All right? And we can see that stress in almost every single thing that they do. All right. Also, there's also some fun facts, like they believe that, you are born evil and you have to be made good. And so that's why you have to sort of punish children because they haven't been made into good people yet. All right. Very different than our sort of current philosophy on children and child raising. But this is one of my favorite quotes, and I feel like it really captures the tension of being a Puritan. And John Winthrop, who was the first governor of Massachusetts, he's talking about getting some exercise one day. He said, "When I had some time abstained from such worldly delights as my heart most desired, I grew into great dullness and discontent. Which being at last perceived, I examined my heart, and finding it needful to recreate my mind with some outward recreation, I yielded unto it, and by a moderate exercise herein was much refreshed." So basically, I was growing tired and sleepy, so I went out for some exercise. "But by degrees I ensnared my heart so far in worldly delights as I cooled the graces of the Spirit by them." So this is, I need some exercise in order to keep praying and to keep thinking about God, but once I go out and start exercising, I better make sure I'm not doing it just for my own joy, and I better not sort of lose God in my heart through my own seeking of pleasure. This is all the time. Everything they're doing, everything they're thinking is this balance of, I need to do things here in this world, but I also need to balance my sort of spiritual duties. And so back to Plymouth, just one very important thing to note. Plymouth is founded in 1620 on a ghost town known as Patuxet. And this ghost town happened because in 1617 to 1619, a plague of smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, etc., ripped through the Wampanoags and killed 90% of them. And so when they arrived, had they come 5 years earlier, the densely packed Native Americans would have just pushed them back out to sea, or killed them, or it would have been like another Roanoke. But instead, they're able to form an alliance with Massasoit for their mutual protection. The Wampanoags need them to protect themselves from the Pequots. The Pilgrims obviously need the Wampanoags to do anything, to get corn, to protect themselves, etc., etc., etc. So that's sort of there, and sort of, when the Pilgrims land and they see that there's just bones all over the ground, they say to themselves, "Blessed be God for clearing our way." All right, so that's their mindset. All right, but much more historically significant, we have the Mass Bay founding, in which we have a city on a hill. And they really believe that they're here to create, as I said before, a model for a perfect Christian community. And in the first 20 years, they get 20,000 people. This is sort of seen as we're going to abandon the corruption of England and the corruption of Charles II, and we are off. And more importantly, they're transporting families. And they are really trying to transplant their society somewhere else, where places like New York and Virginia are in it to make money. where places like South Carolina are in it to expand their slave holdings. This is a place that is trying to transport an English model. So it is going to be the least diverse colony. They do not mix with Native Americans, really. They do not mix with their slaves, really, which they do have, African slaves, although much lower in number. This is going to be the most homogenous area of America for a very long time, much less diverse. And so when this sort of stress of we all need to obey God's law, all right, you have built in within here the problem. All right, what if you disagree about what God's law actually is? And so when we look at the expansion of not only New England towns but New England colonies, it is an expansion of religious dissension. So Rhode Island, for example, founded by Roger Williams, Roger Williams of Roger Williams University. Roger Williams kind of thought he was a kind of a hardcore Puritan preacher. He was in many ways like their number one draft pick. All right, he came all the way over. He was really, really good, really respected, had a very firm understanding of the Bible. But he disagreed with the idea of kicking people out for their religious beliefs. And so he sort of asked to leave in the middle of the night, in the middle of winter. They say, get out. And so he flees in the middle of the snow. The Narragansetts take him in. And he says, we're going to pay Native Americans for their land. We're going to allow other religions to come in because you can't force someone into heaven. You can't torture them into God. It has to be from within their own spirit. So Rhode Island, this is why they make their claim to having religious freedom. And they're very, very close, and they become sort of a safe haven for those people who don't fit into Massachusetts. Connecticut takes the opposite approach. Connecticut is, by 1636, a little annoyed that Massachusetts is so loosey-goosey, so they go and establish a much more strict Puritan society. New Hampshire also was technically established before Massachusetts, but it was a failed colony until religious dissenters, both of the Roger Williams variety and the Connecticut variety, started to filter into that area. But the most important, in my opinion, religious dissenter is Anne Hutchinson. And Anne Hutchinson is really that representative story. Anne Hutchinson was a true believer. She, when back in England, even though she was a mother of 8, she would spend hours on her Sunday driving to 50 to 100 miles to hear her favorite preachers. And then when her most favorite preacher of all, Cotton Mather, came over to the Mass Bay colony, she followed him. So this is someone who, she believes in this. She's not messing around. And she comes all the way over here, and she's a little disappointed about this utopia that she's been promised, this godly community. There are great preachers like the Mathers, but mostly it's sort of young, untrained preachers. Remember, you're not going to attract the best and the brightest to this experiment over to Massachusetts. Hey, come live in cold, frozen Massachusetts where we don't have any paved roads yet. No one's coming. I mean, the 20,000 are coming, but you're not going to attract the most famous preachers. And so she's a little frustrated by this. And she sort of voices the frustration in people's homes. She's in people's homes because she's a midwife. She's delivering babies, and by all accounts, she was quite a good midwife. And so as she's visiting women in their homes, she begins sort of talking about the Bible. It becomes very, very clear that this Anne Hutchinson knows way more about the Bible than the preachers that they've been able to attract into this colony. And so both men and women begin to sort of come and hear her speak in what becomes an underground religious movement, challenging the authority of the preachers themselves. And this is not something you can have. Not only do we have sort of a battle about the true meaning of the Bible, and you have disagreement about the meaning of the Bible, disagreement that could cause God's wrath to come down on your head, but it's a woman challenging the male leadership. Holy moly, all right, you can't have that. All right, so she is sort of called forth. Oh, and I should keep going. She also would go to various congregations, stand up in the middle of the congregation, and point by point argue these preachers and win these arguments. And so she's called forth among the religious and political leaders of Massachusetts, and she is sort of called to account. And even though she's 7 months pregnant, in the middle of winter, she stands there for 3 days and argues them down. At the end of the 3rd day, she cracks. She says, yes, God has spoken to me. And what she's been arguing is that the other preachers, in their ignorance, are saying that things you do here on earth could give you grace in the eyes of God. And she's saying that's just a little too Catholic. And she was probably right. But doesn't matter. They don't like the cut of her jib, so they kick her out. And she flees, surprise, surprise, to Rhode Island. And then later she will leave Rhode Island for reasons I cannot remember. And she will go to New York, in which she gets caught in the middle of a battle between New Yorkers and Native Americans, and she is killed by Native Americans on what is today the Hutchinson River, in which there's a road named the Hutchinson River Parkway, so that's Anne Hutchinson. But probably her most important impact was demonstrating to everybody that the religious leadership didn't really know what they were talking about. So in order to train a future generation of religious leaders, the Puritans opened up a college. That college today is called Harvard University. So she is the mother of Harvard University. But just like Virginia with Bacon's Rebellion, Generation 2.0, and it really is Generation 2.0, is going to get into a violent and bloody war. It's the deadliest war in American history if you do it based on percentage of the population killed, and based on number of towns destroyed. It is brutal. And it starts when King Philip, who was the English name for Metacomet, the Wampanoag leader, who is actually the son of Massasoit, the guy who first welcomed the Pilgrims, says enough is enough, and for many reasons he fights back against them. The English just aren't treating him fairly, and we'll leave it at that. And so he unites Native American tribes in a massive resistance, in which you can see just how widespread this fighting really was. The most famous massacre in this battle, in this war, is the Deerfield Massacre, which you can read about online if you're interested. But it is brutal. And 25% of New England settlements are destroyed. The population numbers will not recover for 100 years. Not until the American Revolution do we have Massachusetts is back on its feet. But even though this was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, the New Englanders will win. And they will, the most important thing here is destroy Indian resistance in New England. So this is the end of tribes acting independently from the broader English society. There are still Native Americans living in New England. There are still Native Americans today. Just go to Foxwoods Casino and you'll see a Native American settlement. But they are living among white society. They are no longer living separate from. So we have now sort of demolished Native Americans in the New England area. They're still very powerful in upstate New York, still very powerful in Georgia, but this is the beginning of a process that we're going to see continue on and on and on over the next 200 years of American history. So let's leave New England and these very serious Puritans fighting their battles against Native Americans and religious battles against each other, and we will jump to the middle colonies. So we're going to go a little faster through these next couple colonies. New York was once New Amsterdam, established by the Dutch East India Company. And because this was a place looking to turn a profit, they didn't care who you were. You're Jewish, come on in. You are, you're Native American, whatever. You're Dutch, cool. And so by, I think, 1640, someone counted 36 different languages being spoken in New York. So it is a very diverse colony. It also has about 15 to 20% of its population is African slaves. And what New York sort of gets established, so first of all, the English will conquer it in 1665 in a bloodless battle. Basically, the English boats come in and New Yorkers kind of hold up their hands and say, we're good, and don't fight. And the English sort of let everyone stay and everyone's happy and it's now English. So I'm just going to call it New York for that reason. And it sort of gets established in the fur and grain trade. The fur trade with Native Americans, this is the beaver fur. They're trading with the Iroquois Confederation, who we can see up there in upstate New York. And that's sort of one of the major sources of income. The other one is grain. People will farm, grow 2 to 3 times more than what they need, and then sell that grain beyond. So we're not talking, there are very large land holdings in New York, like Rensselaer, etc. But mostly we're talking about middle colonies have mid-level farmers, all right? Not major plantation owners, not subsistence farmers like what you have in Western Massachusetts, but pretty basic stuff. And so Pennsylvania, they'll have a similar sort of economy, but it is founded by Quakers. And so therefore, Quakers believe that every single individual is equal. Everyone has their own little light And so therefore they are going to allow lots of different people to come in and actually advertise for lots of different people to come in. Germans and Swedes and Dutch and French, and they're saying, "Come on into Pennsylvania. You can practice your religion. You can have a little piece of land." And this will also be a place where you have mid-level grain farmers. And Philadelphia will become very quickly the largest city in the colonies. And by largest city, I mean 25,000 people. New York had about 12,000 people. Boston had about 15,000 people. So when we say cities, keep that in mind that we're not talking that many people. But Philadelphia is the freest place. So when 13-year-old Benjamin Franklin decides that he's sick of living underneath the watch of his brother and his parents, where does he go? He goes to Philadelphia to make a name for himself. If you're sick of being controlled, you go there. So give you a sense of what Pennsylvania is like. And so now we need to sort of visit some other places. And it looks like my slide on the southern states has gone missing. So I will cover that in just a little bit. Oops. All right, so first of all, we have, when we're looking at British North America, we need to realize that the English for a good chunk of time were not a big deal. These are a couple people living right on the edge of the Atlantic seaboard, but there are much larger and more economically important places all throughout the Americas. So first we got New France, to the north and west of the British North American colonies. And the way they do things differently is that they can never really attract the same numbers of people. So France has a lot of land and very few Frenchmen come into the New France area. And so what they do is they really rely on Native Americans for their economic survival. This is going to be fur trappers and traders. That's the basis of their economy. And so they need to make alliances, either marriage alliances, trade relations with Native Americans. They view the Indians as partners and allies. So for most Native Americans, France is a much better deal. They respect your sovereignty and they respect you, and they go out of their way to demonstrate that respect towards you. However, they don't quite have the stuff that the English do. The English have better manufactured goods and much more people and much more wealth. So this is sort of the challenge if you're a Native American. Do you go with France, who has less stuff and will respect your sovereignty? Or do you go with the English, who has better stuff but clearly doesn't really like you, given King Philip's War, given Bacon's Rebellion, and given lots of other Native American conflicts we'll see. And so for the vast majority of Native Americans, they will side with New France. The one exception is going to be the Iroquois, who's going to lean a little more English at times. And that's mostly because their enemies, the Hurons, are wholeheartedly devoted to the French. And so that's going to become important in chapter 4. The other place is what we want to talk about is New Spain. All right, New Spain was much, much bigger, stretching from California all the way down to Chile. And surprisingly enough, there have been a lot of questions on New Spain on the APUSH test. So just mentioning it now, because California, New Mexico, Texas, Florida, those are part of America now. And so their founding story is not necessarily the English, their founding story is the Spanish. And so they, just like the French, were much more mixed up with the Native Americans than the English were. The English had a much more strict sort of racial code than the other ones do. The Spanish will be exceptionally mixed, but their mixing will create a racial hierarchy where at the top is white, at the bottom is black, and in the middle is lots of different gradations like mulatto and mestizo, etc. Where sort of, if you are white and Native American, you're sort of at the second tier. If you're white and black, you're kind of at tier 4. And so it's a very strict racial hierarchy, but also a lot more racial mixing than what you'll see in the British colonies. They employ slavery as well. Indian slavery, known as the encomienda system, which is always on the APUSH test. And their sort of defining moment is the Pueblo Revolt, at least defining to the place that's in the United States. And that's something I highly recommend you looking up before the APUSH test, but to keep this lecture under an hour, I am going to move forward. And so then the other place we need to sort of tackle is the Caribbean sugar colonies. If you are a mercantilist empire like Britain, France, Netherlands, etc., you don't want New York. What are you going to get? Beaver skins, wood products, grain. You want a colony in the Caribbean. So the Caribbean is where the fight really was. In the Caribbean sugar colonies, we're talking about 90 to 95% of the population is as enslaved African Americans. Only South Carolina ever even gets a majority of enslaved Africans at 60%. All the other colonies, Massachusetts 4%, Virginia 25%, Pennsylvania 7%, New York 15%. We're talking much smaller numbers. Also, the labor in the sugar colonies was famously harsh. If you were a slave who arrived in the sugar colonies, you were probably going to live 5 to 7 years before you were worked to death, which means you need to have a much, much, much larger number of supply coming into your colony all the time of enslaved people across the Middle Passage. This were very capital intensive, and I decided to show you an image of a boiling house rather than an image of a sugar field, so you can get a sense of how capital intensive sugar plantations were, how much wealth you needed to pump into these places in order to get wealth out of them. But the potential for profit was huge, and so the best example of that is Jamaica. Jamaica is small. Go look at a map. You'll see it's small. But it was 5 times more valuable to England than all 13 colonies of British North America combined. And so think about all the cod, tobacco, grain, rice, indigo, all of that stuff that was sold was 1/5 the value of the sugar produced in Jamaica at a single year. So, for the most part, get the sense that British North America, while for us is a very big deal, for the rest of the world, we're sort of the frontier hinterlands area. Like we're not the story. The story is going on other places. The story is in the Potosi silver mine of Bolivia. The story is in the Caribbean sugar plantations. That's where you are concerned with. And so back to what I was saying with the number of slaves being brought. These are the number of slaves in the Middle Passage over the course of about 400 years. 500,000 will come to British North America. These 500,000 people will turn into 4 million slaves by the time of the Civil War. But the numbers don't even compare to the areas that grow sugar. So look at 2 million to the British Caribbean. That's Jamaica and a few other islands. 1.6 million to the French Caribbean. Pretty much, we're talking about Haiti. 4 million to Brazil. These numbers pale in comparison. That's not to excuse American slavery, which is brutal and terrible in its own right. But when we're talking about just simply scale, it does not compare to the Caribbean and the sugar plantations down there, to give you a sense of what's going on internationally. So one just sort of thing, and I hope you noticed when we're talking about here, is there's sort of a pattern. You got establishment, and then 2 to 3 generations later, everything goes to heck. And so you see that within about a 15-year period, every region we've explored has some sort of major conflict. I'm not going to give you any sort of explanation why. It'll take a really good historian to give you that. I hope someone out there writes this book, but you have Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, which is a conflict over land. You have King Philip's War in Massachusetts, which is a conflict over land. You have the Beaver Wars, which we did not cover, which are essentially the Iroquois seizing control over the beaver supply in order to trade with the French and the English and taking out other Native American tribes. So essentially we're talking about control over land. And you have the Pueblo Revolt from 1680 to 1692. They drive out the Spanish from New Mexico. So maybe it's just coincidence that all these things are happening at the same time, but I think it's worth sort of noting that we have a period of immense turmoil going on. But let's get back to some British policy. So the question goes, how independent were these colonies? Right? Were they just sort of groups of people stuck over on the other side of the ocean? Were they English? Were they American? Were they both? Where are they? And so what degree did Mother England influence them? So one thing we need to talk about before we establish the degree of control that that England had over its colonies, we need to understand why they would want to control them in the first place. So first of all, British and French and Spanish all believed in mercantilism, merchant. And mercantilism was the economic philosophy that said there's a limited amount of stuff in the world. There's a limited amount of gold, limited amount of sugar, limited amount of all of that. All right. And any trade that goes to your enemies is wealth leaving your country and going to the enemies. And so colonies will exist in order to enrich the mother country. It's not like today where we really believe in free trade. That idea was more established by Adam Smith in the book Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, which is sort of the opening treatise for capitalism. But with mercantilism, it was this idea that the colonies provided raw materials and a market for manufactured goods. So the colonies are there to grow stuff, chop down trees, etc. And this won't be totally lacking in benefit to the colonies because we trade exclusively with England and we need to get our stuff to England. You see a shipbuilding industry come out of North America, or out of, Massachusetts. You have certain development of certain materials like iron get developed in the United States, or what will become the United States because of this. But that's sort of the idea. You have to trade with us. If you trade with Spain, if you trade with France, you are hurting us. It's sort of the major idea. And we need you to buy our stuff so that we have a market for our stuff. And so that's sort of the role of the colonies in this. However, and you see, you see this enforced through something called the Navigation Acts. So basically, the colonies get established. They're very small private experiments, and over time, they will grow into sort of economically viable societies. Not huge deals, nothing like Jamaica, but enough that you would like to see that wealth come into you. And so with the Navigation Acts, and there's a series of Navigation Acts passed over multiple decades, essentially tried to enforce mercantilism. I have a slide on the next page that explains the Navigation Acts pretty well. So pause on the Navigation Acts. The Dominion of New England was an idea that after sort of the English Civil War and after the restoration of the monarchy, James II tries to sort of reorganize the colonial governments. He says, this is a mess. We got Plymouth, we got Mass Bay, we got Rhode Island, we got Connecticut, we got New York, we've got all these places. Let's just lump them all into one. It'd be much more efficient if we have one governor for all of those colonies together. He'll be based out of Boston. And this will be great. Obviously, people who've grown a little bit accustomed to their own form of self-government don't love this, but they give it a shot. However, we'll get to what happens to them later. Back to the Navigation Acts. The idea was that you have to send everything through England so that it could be taxed, and so everything has to go through there. And Americans will largely ignore the Navigation Acts. They will trade with whoever they want, whenever they want, because they want to. And it makes them more money. Sometimes England pays the high prices, so they'll trade with England. Sometimes England does not pay the high prices, so they won't. They'll trade with France or the colonies. They'll especially trade with the Caribbean. The Caribbean is one of the major purchasers of things like rice and fish. You got to feed the slaves something, and you can't feed them sugar. And so a lot of the American products that we make will actually be sent south, not east. And so anyway, back to the Dominion of New England, it fails. James II, in his attempt to assert authority over America, well, that just reflects the type of authority he was attempting to assert over England, and it didn't make people happy. For you Anglophiles out there, obviously I'm not doing this justice, but William and Mary end up overthrowing James II. They're sort of invited to overthrow him by certain members of Parliament, and they do. And you have the end of the Dominion of New England. They say, everything, we'll go back to the way things were. Massachusetts, because we're from Massachusetts, and therefore we care about Massachusetts, becomes officially a royal colony. They have to accept Anglican rule. The church membership is no longer the decider if you have the right to vote or not. It's now land ownership. And Plymouth and Mass Bay become united into Massachusetts. So there is some other reorganization that happens, but you go back to a system of more localized control, and James II is overthrown. And what we establish from here forward is a period historians like to call salutary neglect. And you'll read more about this in chapter 4. But basically, there are laws governing the colonies. There are colonial governors governing the colonies, appointed by the king. There are navigation acts deciding where the colonies can trade, and all of these are largely unenforced. And so there's technically royal authority in the colonies, but the colonies themselves will largely do whatever they want, and they will not follow those navigation acts. And Parliament in England will essentially look the other way because they don't really care. Partially, they don't care because they start to believe that trade is more important and will benefit everybody. Partially, they don't care for other reasons that you can read about in Chapter 4. But this is called salutary neglect, and it's very important to understanding the American mindset going into the American Revolution. Basically, you let us run ourselves for 150 years. Why are you trying to assert authority now in the year 1763? That seems ridiculous. And so that is the end of our lecture. What you should do now is you should possibly think about reviewing any information, maybe scanning through Chapter 2. This was the minimum amount of information you need. If you have any questions, you're also welcome to email me, Jonathan Greiner, and through the summer course page, and let me know if you have any questions on the lecture itself. As I said, I did not cover South Carolina, so it might be worth going and looking at the section called Restoration Colonies. But essentially what you need to know about South Carolina is that it was established by people from Barbados, and they brought their slaves with them from the beginning. They saw this as an opportunity to create slave plantations, and they will end up with 60% of their population will be enslaved. And Georgia will be established for an entirely different reason. They'll be established as a place for debtors to escape debtors' prison, but this is a failed experiment because sending a bunch of poor people into the wilderness doesn't work. And very quickly, slave owners from South Carolina will bleed into Georgia as well. And so Georgia will kind of take on the pattern of South Carolina, which is large slave plantations. So, sorry about that last little bit at the end there. Have a great day.